For those of you who have been here before, this is kind of the last of the descriptions of what happened to the Indigenous folks who were here long before we were here in the Old Northwest Territories and the Middle West. Our presenter is Jake Ryan. Ryan is not an Indigenous person, but he was raised on the Mississippi River and close to where the Sac and the Fox tribes lived, and became something of an expert. And when he went to school, and let's see, he has a BS from Olivet Nazarene and an MS from Illinois State University. And he did his master's on what happened in the Fox War, which we will conclude today with in 1832. So we're going to start with the War of 1812, when a lot of tribes were still here, and what happened after that. I give you Jake Ryan.
Thank you. So we're going to start, like I've done with several presentations before this, with a land acknowledgement. This is primarily meant as a start to the conversation in the hopes that we can both reflect on the land and the place and the people that have been here before as we start this conversation together. So together we acknowledge that we gather here in Holland, that we are on the traditional land of the Peoria, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwa, and the Odawa peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. As a community, we recognize the ever-present systemic inequities that stem directly from past wrongdoings. We commit to respecting and reconciling this long history of injustice, as well as committing to being better stewards of this land that we inhabit going forward. So as we've kind of talked already, if you've been to one of my classes before, I see some familiar faces, so maybe you know what we're talking about. But we're going to start primarily with the Louisiana Purchase, which is where we ended our conversation in this past spring. And at this point, this is tribal territories during circa 1500. So I know it looks like it's quite extensive here, but primarily we're going to be talking about here in that Great Lakes region. But lots of these tribes that you see here along the East Coast by the time of 1803 have been pushed into that Midwest, our Midwest area. So it's important to, while we see that this is original traditional lands along the East Coast, by this time, several tribes have been pushed into this area and are going to have an impact and have some alliances with some of the tribes that have already been in this area traditionally for generations. So I just give this as a map, just as a visual, kind of a quick reminder of all the space that we've previously talked about up until this point. But then I would like to then highlight, obviously, the very big purchase of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Obviously, this was a landmark event for American history, involving the acquisition of Louisiana Territory from the French First Republic in 1803. This vast, expansive land included most of the area within the Mississippi River Valley drainage basin located west of the river. Obviously, this big, huge green swath right here along the Mississippi River. And we get to point to where I grew up several times in this presentation. But if you want to look right now, it's this tiny little spot where the Mississippi River goes east to west. It's the only spot on the Mississippi River that goes east to west. So it's just a unique little spot. And that's actually where one of our main characters was born, raised, and fought for his entire life that we'll be talking about later on. So in exchange for $15 million, equating to roughly $18 per square mile, the United States claimed nominal ownership of approximately 828,000 square miles with the purchase of Louisiana Purchase. This obviously now comprises much of the central United States, and despite the official agreement, France actually controlled only a very small portion of this land. At the time of the purchase, most of this land that was acquired by the United States was inhabited by numerous Native American tribes who lived throughout the area and worked primarily in a trade fashion with most of the French fur traders in this area. Another key portion before we get too deep into the War of 1812 is that I do want to talk about a couple of key individuals. These key individuals are individuals that are both very important to the War of 1812, as well as individuals that have significant impact to our final main character that we'll talk about a little bit later on as well. So obviously the first is Tecumseh, which is right here on your far left. Tecumseh, born 1768, was a Shawnee leader, orator, and strategist who sought to unite Indigenous nations across the Great Lakes and Ohio valleys in resistance to the United States expansion. Born in Springfield, Ohio, he grew up during a period of intense conflict as settlers pushed into the Shawnee lands in Ohio. Alongside his brother, also known as the Prophet, he helped establish Prophetstown, which was a multi-tribal community in present-day Indiana that became a center for resistance to the United States expansion. He traveled widely, urging tribes to join a confederacy to reject the land sales of the United States. He was remembered as one of the most influential Indigenous leaders in the area, in this area and this time period, admired for both his vision of Native unity and sovereignty. His brother, as I obviously already mentioned, is the Prophet. I've never been good at this. I've been talking about the Prophet for probably 15 years at this point, maybe a little bit longer, and I can still never say his name correctly, so I'm not going to butcher it for you now, because I feel that's slightly disrespectful that I still can't say his name correctly. I get really stuck up on the how many A's are in his name. So we're just going to call him the Prophet, which is what he's known, both by Indigenous peoples at this time and also by most of the recountings done by American writers during this time. So the Prophet obviously was a Shawnee religious leader and the younger brother of Tecumseh. Originally named Lalawiki, he struggled in his early life with poverty, alcoholism, and the lack of distinction. But around 1805, he experienced a powerful vision that transformed him into a strong spiritual leader. He preached a return to traditional Native life ways, rejecting things from the West, such as alcohol, manufactured goods, and the accommodation to American expansionism. His teachings attracted a wide following, and with the help of establishing Prophetstown in present-day Indiana, he was both a religious and political figure in Native resistance. Although his influence was later overshadowed by his older brother, the Prophet remained a key figure throughout this time period, inspiring spiritual renewal and unity among diverse Indigenous peoples. He is remembered as a visionary prophet who sought to restore Native cultural strength in the region. And the last is Men Pok or Men Posh, depending on which translation you get. You get some from a French, some from an American, some from an English. So you either will see it with the HE or just the POC. So Men Polk doesn't actually have too many portraits that were portrayed of him, primarily because he was actually farther west into Illinois. When we know that sounds ridiculous that it's far west into Illinois, but at this time frame, there were not a lot of artists that could get all the way into Illinois and be able to take portraits of indigenous leaders at the time. So there's one rendering, but it's debated. So I'm not going to show that to you in the hopes that I'm giving you accurate and true information rather than trying to portray someone that may or may not be the correct individual. So Men Polk was a prominent Potawatomi war chief in the St. Joseph River area, who became known for his fierce resistance to the American expansion. Renowned as both a warrior and spiritual leader, he is said to have possessed great power as a medicine man. Men Polk gained significant influence in the War of 1812, as we were going to start talking about this more and more, when he allied with the British and Tecumseh's Confederacy, leading raids against American settlements and military outposts throughout the Great Lakes and primarily the Illinois Territory. While he lost most of his influence after the War of 1812, he continued to rally resistance against American authority, refusing to sign treaties that ceded Potawatomi lands. He refused to compromise which made him a symbol of defiance, and U.S. officials continued to see him as one of the most dangerous Indigenous leaders of the time. He's remembered as a determined defender of Potawatomi sovereignty, primarily. All right, so we're going to talk about some things that are less than ideal, which is obviously war. The War of 1812 is not actually fought in just the year 1812, which is just a misnomer. Does anybody know how many years the war actually lasted? About 3.5. Primarily the major amount of fighting is actually going to have been done in the first 1.5 years with some minor skirmishes afterwards. So we're going to talk about a couple of the major battles, primarily because these major battles, one, had significant Indigenous presence in these, and two, were victories for Indigenous peoples. As by the end, obviously, much of this is going to still remain in defeat. But the first couple that we're going to talk about are significant because they'll happen in and around our Michigan area. So brief background real quick on the War of 1812. When the United States declared war against Britain in June of 1812, the response from British forces and their Native American allies was both immediate and decisive. Their coordinated attacks had a dramatic impact on the American foothold in our Great Lakes region and quickly altered the balance of power here in Michigan. By leveraging their strategic alliances and superior knowledge of the land, these forces were able to challenge American expansionism and control the area, setting the stage for significant confrontations that would follow. In less than a month after the declaration of war by the Americans, British and Native troops successfully captured Fort Mackinac. Everybody know where that's at, right? Cool. Without firing a single weapon. The fort provided an opportunity to control the Straits of Mackinac, which served as a key access point to both Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. Because water travel was faster than any other travel at the time frame, this was dramatically impacting both the supply lines of American troops and supplying American forts here in the Great Lakes region. So this victory gave British and Native forces the upper hand very early in the war. Taking full advantage of this quick victory, these allies moved swiftly down both the lakes to take out key American strongholds here in our area. First one, obviously, is the Battle of Fort Dearborn. The Battle of Fort Dearborn, does anybody know where Dearborn is? Chicago, yeah. There's actually still a landmark spot right along the Chicago River in the heart of the city. It's really, really weird because you're just driving by and it's super busy, and then it's all of a sudden like, oh, here's a plaque to talk about Fort Dearborn. After the U.S. lost Fort Mackinac, tensions erupted at Fort Dearborn, a small outpost on the southern tip of Lake Michigan in modern-day Chicago. The garrison, commanded by Captain Nathan Held, numbered fewer than 100 soldiers and militia alongside civilian families. Following the orders from General William Hull out of Detroit, Held prepared to evacuate the fort and march east to Fort Wayne. Surrounding the area were bands of Potawatomi warriors and joined by some Odawa and Ojibwe allies, who viewed the fort's abandonment as an opportunity to reclaim the territory and further resist U.S. encroachment. Though Held promised to distribute the fort's supplies to local tribes as they left, he secretly destroyed all the gunpowder, the arms, and all the food, an act seen treacherous and disrespectful to the Native American leaders that he agreed with. By going back on his word, many of the Potawatomi believed that they could no longer trust the captain, and it helped to fuel their desires to reclaim the area for their own. On August 15th, so about a month and a half or so after the declaration of war, the column of soldiers and civilians left the fort, only to be ambushed by several hundred Potawatomi along the lakeshore. Native warriors, well prepared and familiar with the terrain, everybody remembers along the basin, kind of by Michigan City and everything else like that. When you walk along the lakeshore, there's tons and tons of dunes. And using using the dunes and the superior knowledge of the land, they were quickly able to overtake the poorly organized U.S. force in what is estimated to have only taken about 15 minutes. Near roughly half the evacuees were killed in the attack, while many survivors, including the women and children, were taken captive and ransomed. Afterward, the fort itself was looted and then burned to the ground. And from an Indigenous perspective, this was a bold assertion of autonomy and strength, showing the U.S. posts could be destroyed and that Native resistance in the Great Lakes region remained extremely formidable at the start of this war. Consequences of Fort Dearborn's fall was far-reaching. For the United States, the loss underscored their vulnerability in the West and fed into the fear of Indigenous allies of the British, reinforcing General Hull's panic just a few days later in Detroit. And for the Potawatomi, the attack demonstrated their military capacity, but also provoked harsh retribution. In the years after the war, the U.S. officials invoked the Fort Dearborn Massacre as justification for punishing the Potawatomi and accelerating land secessions in Illinois. Thus, while the battle was a short-term victory for Indigenous forces and their British allies, it fueled long-term consequences that deepened U.S. hostility and hastened the erosion of Potawatomi homelands. Next major battle that we're going to talk about, notice that it is still August of 1812. And in just a few days later, we go to the east side of our great state of Michigan and talk about the British and Native American assault on Detroit. Much of this assault was actually owed to the strength and the presence and skill of Tecumseh and his Indigenous Confederacy. As General Isaac Brock of the British moved against the American garrison, Tecumseh brought together hundreds of warriors from Shawnee, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, which we also know as Chippewa, Odawa, Menominee, Sauk, Fox nations, and many others. These fighters have already proven themselves by cutting General Hull's supply lines in Ohio, making it even more difficult for Detroit to both field their garrison as well as pass along supplies to Dearborn. So not only did they cut off Mackinac along the water, but when they started trying to bring supplies through Ohio and into Michigan to try to get to Detroit, they were blocking, Tecumseh and his Confederacy were blocking that off too. So at this point, Detroit is kind of in a chokehold with supplies running out, limited ammunition, and a relatively small garrison for this fort. They were then told to lead an attack for whatever reason. We talk about like the Secretary of War and we talk about, you know, the War Department and all these individuals. Some of them are still like really well-known veterans from the American Revolution. Some of these guys just don't know what they're doing. General Hull was actually requested to make a raid into what is now Canada. So they obviously crossed in Detroit, what is now Toronto, and started going up the river along the lakes to try to create an attack. Unfortunately, they were quickly pushed back, and once realizing that they would be slaughtered on the field, they retreated back to Detroit really quickly. We're talking like a week and a half that led up to this then siege of Detroit. So while all this is still happening in Dearborn, and obviously communications are slow, so Dearborn is currently okay, but they both hear that Mackinac has been taken, and so now they're both trying to make decisions. General Hull getting more communication since he is closer to all of the decision makers on the East Coast, is then told that he needs to make an attack, and while that attack is happening, the loss of Dearborn happens at the same time. So like we're talking like really like bang bang, very quick. All of a sudden, you've lost three of your major hubs and strongholds in what is then the Northwest Territory very, very quickly. And worst part of this is you're the ones that declared war. The Americans are the ones that said, let's go to war, and immediately take an 0-3 loss very, very quickly to this. So as General Hull retreats back to what is seen as a strength in the fort at Detroit. Tecumseh uses his confederacy and knowledge of the terrain to give persistent raids both on supply lines, but then also is able to kind of maintain and contain General Hull and his forces until the British are able to arrive from, I believe, Quebec. No, Ontario. I'm sorry. It's a lot of information. Although British and Native soldiers had actually Native warriors had fought together before, Detroit is actually the first place where the alliance had devastating consequences for the Americans. So as I mentioned already, Dearborn was actually done solely by Potawatomi warriors. There was no British involvement whatsoever with that. It's just a very, very happy coincidence that all of this happened very quickly for the British at the early parts of the War of 1812. Thankfully for the British and the British allies, Tecumseh's leadership went beyond just battlefield tactics, recognizing the psychological edge that his indigenous warriors had over Hull's troops. He deliberately orchestrated multiple maneuvers to exaggerate their numbers, moving his men in repeated circles so that they appeared to be a significantly larger army around the outsides of the fort. Hull's soldiers and civilian dependents, already shaken by the news of the recent Fort Dearborn attack, because as they had retreated, they did get that final notice that, by the way, Dearborn was just lost. And this is probably within, let me see. Yeah, 3 days of knowing that. So they sent a runner, and obviously the runner got to Detroit just as they were being fully contained by Indigenous and British forces. So with the fear stoked by both the psychological edge that Tecumseh was able to bring, as well as hearing about the loss from Dearborn, conducted by Potawatomi warriors, it then stood that Brock was able to capitalize on this perception, warning Hull that he could no longer restrain his Native American allies, and that this could turn very bloody for them very quickly. The combined effect was able to convince Hull that resistance would absolutely result in a complete massacre of all American forces. Hull then surrendered very quickly. There was actually no battle again of this area. So more than 2,000 troops, along with their weapons, supplies, and the fort itself, passed into British and Native hands with scarcely a shot fired. For Britain, this was the third strategic victory within a month and a half, but for Tecumseh and his Confederacy, it was proof that coordinated resistance could humble the United States. The Indigenous role here at Detroit was decisive. Without Tecumseh's warriors, the psychological edge they brought, and the disruption of the supply lines for this region, Hull might have attempted a very prolonged defense of Detroit. Instead, Detroit fell quickly within a day, standing as one of the most important Native-assisted victories of the War of 1812, and a high point for Tecumseh's vision of a united Indigenous front. Obviously, I've talked about a lot of positive things for the British and not so much for the Americans, but there is one more major battle that I would like to talk about as we talk about the War of 1812. And that battle is the Battle of Thames. So I tried to give you a little bit more of a visual here. So we're talking about this space right here, which is called Moraviantown. It is actually right in that space that this battle is going to be taking place. And I tried to give you a map here as well of kind of what the battlefield looked like. But as you can see, this is kind of this region that we're talking about. I'm including Canada in the Great Lakes because this is primarily where most of the battles were fought. So the most significant battle obviously took place in 1813. This is in October. After the successful siege of Detroit and Dearborn and Mackinac, British and Native allies occupied the fort until Americans gained control of Lake Erie in September and severed the British supply lines to the fort. So obviously we're talking about in this space right here that most of the supply lines at this point for British forces were coming through Lower Canada, and then Upper Canada, and then making their way to Detroit. Those supply lines were cut off by the Americans being able to push across Lake Erie and disrupt supply lines here. The superior naval force that that the United States were able to put on Lake Erie drastically impacted supplies and basically reversed the situation that the British had been able to be so successful with against the Americans in Detroit. So now the British are the ones that are holding on to Detroit and trying to retain control, and the Americans are on the offensive. Tecumseh, or at this point, Major General Proctor decided that the British forces would abandon the fort in Detroit and retreat back along the Thames River and back up through Canada, feeling that they could no longer retain the fort. Tecumseh and his warriors were very reluctant to leave such a secure location, but knowing that they would be outmatched without the alliance of British forces, chose to accompany them anyway. In abandoning the fort of Detroit, Tecumseh and other chiefs expected that this action would leave tribal allies farther in the west of Detroit exposed to continued American expansionism, but saw no other way to hold the territory without the British allies. Poorly managed and ill-timed, this British retreat through the Thames River Valley was marked by significant difficulties. The withdrawal was slow, disorganized, leading to a growing sense of demoralization among British troops. As the results dragged on, Tecumseh's confederacy of warriors grew increasingly restless. The abandonment of allied tribes and the British reluctance to confront the pursuing American forces only heightened tensions. This combination of factors caused frustration among native warriors and leaders, and the situation soon reached a breaking point as the desperate groups struggled with the challenges of retreat in the absence of a clear plan of resistance going forward. When the day of the battle came on October 5th of 1813, Tecumseh and his Indigenous Confederacy played the decisive role in resisting U.S. forces after the British lines collapsed. As the confrontation became certain, Tecumseh promised the warriors that there would be no retreat. This battle, he felt, must be won in order to stop American westward expansion in all areas of the United States. While Proctor's 800 troops quickly surrendered, Tecumseh rallied roughly 500 to 1,000 warriors drawing from all Great Lake tribes, including the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Odawa, the Sauk, and the Fox Indians. These fighters withstood the worst of the battle, holding off General William Henry Harrison's 3,500 soldiers and Kentucky cavalry. Despite their determined resistance, Tecumseh was actually killed during this battle, a devastating blow that shattered all hopes of his pan-Indigenous Confederacy and a united Indigenous front. For the Great Lakes nations, it marked a significant loss of a unifying leader and the decline of coordinated armed resistance in the area. On a larger scale, the American victory cleared the way for the United States to claim the native interior of North America, with more treaty negotiations following, resulting in numerous removals of indigenous tribes from the land and most of the eastern woodland Indian communities farther west. After this war of 1812, the U.S. negotiated over 200 Indian treaties that included ceding lands, and 99 of these agreements resulted in the creation of reservations west of the Mississippi River. Both the war and the treaties that ended it proved devastating to all Eastern Indian nations. The Ghent Agreement halted U.S. expansion into Iroquois land in Canada, and some native communities of the Great Lakes managed to remain in their original home areas, but their small groups posed no threat to the existence or the expansion of the United States. So as we get to the end of this war, obviously, we don't speak with British accents, so obviously this went really poorly for the British in the long run. And the Americans were able to then use this both as a justification for further treaties in this area, and use it as a major chip against indigenous tribes. So any tribe, clan, band, group of individuals that fought against them in the War of 1812 were dealt with very harshly and pushed further and further west. Later on down in a couple of slides, you'll see where some of these tribes came from originally and where they were pushed to in the west of the Mississippi River. And I'll stop on that for a little bit just because there is a ton of movement in that space. But I do want to talk about a couple of these treaties before we get too far into that. So this is a map that you can see that kind of deals with a 25 to 30-ish year period where most of these places that are highlighted are actually space where tribes were, as well as some of the effects that some of these treaties had. I believe it's my next slide is going to show how quickly that changes right after 1819, and we're going to get into the 1820s and 30s. And this is going to be the significant portion of what our final main character is going to be so disgruntled about. So some of these treaties that I'm going to point out to, the Treaty of Spring Wells in 1850 dealt primarily with tribes that were Shawnee, Miami, Ohio, Ottawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi. The context of this did help end the hostilities between these tribes and the United States that had sided with the British during the War of 1812. Some of the terms included restored tribes to the status quo before the war, but reaffirmed earlier U.S. land claims, so no land was returned. The impact is that the U.S. used this basically as a reset point, recognizing tribes as the defeated parties in this treaty, even though they had not formally surrendered in 1814. Another treaty that is significant and very significant to our final main character is the various treaties of St. Louis. This one I point out to is Treaty of 1816. We're going to talk about a previous Treaty of St. Louis too. Treaty of St. Louis is a very loose term. It's been used 16 times in the course of 30 years between 1800 and 1830. So Treaty of St. Louis it's impossible to find like actual concrete, like which treaty was this? Which treaty was this? Unless it's very well written. Unfortunately, penmanship is really bad at this time period. At this time period, and spelling is just made up. The Treaty of St. Louis in 1860 is actually one that is preserved and well documented. And these tribes are primarily involved: the Sauk, the Fox, Potawatomi, the Odawa, and the Ojibwe. So 3 tribes that we know really quite a bit about, and 2 tribes that I know a lot about too, because that's my hometown is actually where the Sauk and the Fox capital was. So this is, again, further land secessions in the states that we now know as Illinois, Wisconsin, and Missouri, aimed at clearing all of this land from indigenous peoples and settling it for settlers, for mining interests, and for farmland. Obviously, these treaties were actually 2 separate treaties between the tribes of the Sacred Fire, so Potawatomi, Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Sauk and the Fox, primarily because their home locations were in drastically different spaces, and while significant allies throughout this time period, they still saw themselves as separate entities. So this time period actually required them both to sign different treaties, although the treaty essentially said the same thing. They were not all there at the same time. Obviously, this impact was significant for primarily the Sauk and the Fox, as they later found the exploitation of this treaty to be one of the final straws for what we will call the Blackhawk War of 1832. One of the other treaties I'd like to point out to is the Treaty of Prairie des Chaunes. I'm not saying that I know French, but I'm pretty sure I butchered that one, which is okay. So the Dakota, the Sauk, the Fox, the Ho-Chunk, which you may know as the Winnebago, the Minoe, the Potawatomi, Ojibwa, and Odawa were all part of these as well. The purpose of this was to attempt to draw boundary lines between tribal lands to stop intertribal conflict and assert U.S. control as the arbitrator. The impact of this is, instead of reducing conflict, it created new resentments because the United States imposed artificial lines that did not reflect traditional native land use. The Treaty of Fond du Lac, that one's a lot easier for me to say, so hopefully I didn't butcher that one too bad either. Is primarily with talking about the Ojibwe And that was in 1826. And actually, this is the Ojibwe bands that were just along Lake Superior. And this was all about securing mineral rights and mineral resources in northern Wisconsin and Minnesota, opening the door for multiple exports from the United States from former Ojibwe lands. Does anybody want to take a guess at what one of the major exports was? You're absolutely right. Copper was obviously the big mineral resource that the United States was hoping for. At the time, copper was used for lots and lots of metalworking and is extremely useful as a commodity for the United States that at this point was already had been through multiple wars and had spent lots and lots of money and needed to find a way to make more money. And the way they did that was by signing a treaty, essentially taking over full mineral rights to copper. And the primarily what we see are Upper Peninsula, northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and northern Minnesota in that region along Lake Superior. The final treaty that I want to point out to real quick here, obviously there's still two on this slide, but the second one has an impact for our the following slide after this as well. But the Treaty of Buttes des Morts primarily involved the Ho-Chunk, the Ojibwe, and the Menominee. The context of this actually leads to our next slide, which, if it will let me, is the Ho-Chunk Uprising of 1827. This was actually trying to force the Ho-Chunk or the Winnebago in Wisconsin to cede basically everything that was left of east of the Mississippi River to the United States. This then led to the Ho-Chunk Uprising that I mentioned in 1827. It's also known as the Winnebago War, and it broke out in the summer of 1827 in what is now present-day Wisconsin. Tensions had obviously been building against the United States as the U.S. brought in lead miners, copper miners, and other settlers to continually encroach on Ho-Chunk lands, which was seen by the Ho-Chunk as a violation of previous agreements. Exploiting trade practices, fraudulent treaty claims, and abuses by various government agents deepened resentment for the Ho-Chunk. Rumors that two Ho-Chunk women had been mistreated and by American keel boatmen further inflamed the situation, leading warriors to continually attack boats along the Mississippi River and assault mining communities near Galena, Illinois. Galena's this little spot right here, just south of the Wisconsin border. Though the fighting was limited in scale, it represented a direct act of resistance against the United States expansion in the upper Mississippi River Valley. The U.S. Army at this point was able to quickly mobilize, with Illinois and Michigan Territory militias joining federal troops to suppress the uprising. After several brief skirmishes, the Ho-Chunk were forced to surrender, and their chiefs were compelled to hand over alleged instigators to the U.S. authorities. In this aftermath, the Ho-Chunk signed new treaties that ceded substantial portions of their territory, accelerating the loss of their homelands in Wisconsin. While the uprising was considered significantly minor compared to further conflicts like the Blackhawk War, it signaled how rising settlers' pressure combined with unjust treaties made violent confrontations increasingly likely in the Great Lakes frontier. So now I'm going to go back and talk, that's obviously this second treaty of Prairie des Chouans, and this dealt obviously with the Ho-Chunk, the Potawatomi, the Sauk, and the Fox, and this was that final, like, we're ending the Ho-Chunk uprising. This is reaffirming that you now no longer have any land east of the Mississippi River in Wisconsin and northern Illinois, and forced primarily most of the Potawatomi bands, as well as, or I'm sorry, not Potawatomi bands, the Ho-Chunk bands, as well as some of the Sauk and Fox across the river, Mississippi River, into reservation plots in Iowa and northern Missouri. The final treaty that I'm going to talk about quick is the Treaty of Chicago, and this deals with our tribes of the Sacred Fire, which is obviously the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Odawa. This further ceded all the land, most or nearly all the land in the state of Michigan, and paved the way for the growth of the city of Chicago. This actually then forced most of the Potawatomi bands into spaces by the Ho-Chunk and the Sauk and Fox in Iowa, essentially creating reservation lands just west of the Mississippi River, essentially pushing most, if not all, tribal peoples out of the state of Michigan at this point. So we're going to talk about the person that I spent thousands of hours researching. And we're going to talk about the last resistance. This is the final indigenous resistance east of the Mississippi River, which is significant because that means that everything that is east of the Mississippi was not only classified as the United States, but there was no major conflicts after this. You're going to go, Jake, what about the Trail of Tears? The Trail of Tears was actually still pushed in this time period and into the 1830s, but it was not an uprising. This was the last like actual physical fighting done by indigenous resistance east of the Mississippi River. Blackhawk. Anybody know a little bit about Blackhawk at all? Literally grew up like we had at least a class every single year from first grade till about eighth grade about Blackhawk, full class because it was a local history thing. Literally my hometown, my house was in the space where Saukenuk, the birthplace, the raising place, and the capital of the Sauk and Fox nations was. So we have lots of information on Blackhawk. We're getting a little bit ahead of myself here quickly, but I've actually held the treaty that ended the Blackhawk Wars of 1832. I got to have a really wonderful experience working with a museum in the area. And as I was doing my capstone paper for my undergrad, which was supposed to only be 20 pages and turned into 37 on Blackhawk, I got to then present that to the museum curator, and she was like, by the way, you should come see this, and got to let me come to the back and like actually hold it with the white gloves and everything, and got to see his mark. So while very devastating, we're going to talk about it. It was still a very impactful moment for me. And this is part of the reason that I'm talking about this stuff to you. Because without my continued experience learning about Blackhawk, learning about the nations where my hometown was, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be in Michigan. I wouldn't be talking to you about any of this stuff because this is what set me up. He is what set me on the path of learning more about indigenous cultures, learning more about the people that are still here, as well as push me to just love history more and more. So we're going to talk about this. This is a very brief rendition of the 37 pages that I wrote on him. So don't worry, we're still going to be done before 11, I promise. But so these are some of the reasons, as you see here on the screen, these are some of the reasons that Blackhawk went to war in 1832. These are not all the reasons. Again, if you want to read the full thing, that's my paper. But some of the things that were very significant to him was the witnessing of the controversial signing of the Treaty of St. Louis in 1804. Notice how I said Treaty of St. Louis again. So this is, I believe, the third treaty that he actually was around for. This was his first, but there were 3 treaties of St. Louis that Blackhawk was around. But primarily the Treaty of St. Louis is the one that ceded, I say that in quotation marks, all the land that the Sauk and Fox had east of the Mississippi River, which included Saukenuk. At this period of time, Blackhawk at this point was around 35 and had already been considered a warrior. His father was a medicine man in the Sauk and Fox nations and gave him prominence, even though he was not actually granted chief status and influential status until after the War of 1812. He was still very significant and was seen as kind of a minor chief at this point and was able to be at the signing of the Treaty of St. Louis in 1804, at which point the Indigenous or the Indian agent at the Treaty of St. Louis, a future president, actually used whiskey and coercion and the miscommunication between translation to exploit these individuals that came. So not only did they get them drunk over, like super drunk over the weekend, they also made sure that they didn't know what they were signing. So they used nefarious means to say, this is what we're doing. We're actually reinforcing our American assistance here in the area. And actually what they were signing away was secessions. So this is unfortunately not uncommon. Many Americans actually didn't speak a native language, and the translation was normally vague and sometimes poor. So this is actually not uncommon for practices for having native peoples sign treaties. But this one in particular was very significant to Blackhawk because it reinforced his belief that Americans cannot be trusted in any way, shape, or form. Obviously, another major factor is that he led Native forces in the War of 1812. After the Treaty of St. Louis in 1804, continually led raiding parties and stuff like that, and was very successful, and got to a point where he led between what is estimated between 300 and 500 warriors. And at that point, he was able to then join our previous main characters in Tecumseh, the Prophet, and Manpawk to fight against the Americans in the War of 1812. Any time that I've previously said Sauk and Fox, I've not said his name, but anytime you hear Sauk and Fox Indians in the War of 1812, more than likely we're talking about Blackhawk. Blackhawk was the one that led those troops, which meant that he did cede leadership to Tecumseh and others, but obviously in his own right was considered a great warrior, and was one that was very trusted both by Tecumseh, the Prophet, and British allies in this time period too. Obviously, because of the region of where they are, he very much felt the repercussions of the Ho-Chunk uprising in 1827. I've talked about this in previous classes and stuff like that, but when we talk about the capital, let's say Sakanak, if Sakanak is what we're talking about a capital, we're not talking about staying there 12 months out of the year. We're talking about staying there probably between 4 and 6. Primarily, that is the spot where they did lots of their farming and everything else, but hunting, gathering, everything else meant that they did large swaths of land along the Mississippi River, which means that they did interact and trade with the Ho-Chunk on a regular basis. We're talking about hundreds of miles, not, oh, cool, I drove from Grand Rapids this morning, like sort of thing or whatever. So we're talking about throughout the course of the year, they interacted with the Ho-Chunk on a regular basis, which is why this feeling of repercussions was felt dramatically by Blackhawk and his people as well. Obviously, he opposed that final treaty of Prairie des Champs in 1829, and obviously the Federal Indian Removal Act in 1830. Let's see here. So the Blackhawk War of 1832 was a brief but very pivotal conflict between the United States and the final coalition of the Sauk, the Fox, and any final Allied bands east of the Mississippi River, led by Blackhawk over ancestral lands along the Rock River and Mississippi River in Illinois. This is what I'm talking about right here. If you can see the screen, that right there is what is now known as the Quad Cities. If you ever drive on I-80, that is where I am from, and that is where, this is the spot where they were coming back to. Great space for fishing or wonderful hiking if you ever happen to stop in the area. There's a great state park there in honor and memory of Blackhawk that I would highly recommend. The war began when Blackhawk and his allied troops, which I'm going to call from now on the British Band, returned across the Mississippi River to resettle villages that they had been forced to abandon under that Treaty of 1829 of Prairie des Champs, which he and many followers considered illegitimate. Their initial intent was to reclaim their homeland, plant their crops, and maintain their communities in the ancestral places that they grew up. But the movement quickly escalated into armed conflict when Illinois militias and U.S. troops perceived this return as an invasion, leading to a series of skirmishes that we are now going to talk about. The first major clash is Stillman's Run, which is going to be right here in 1832 in the month of May. So obviously they came over in April, and in the month of May, a small Illinois detachment ambushed warriors of Blackhawk. The militia, who was poorly trained and unprepared, panicked and then fled, leaving the native forces in full control of the area for over a week. Though the battle was tactical victory for Blackhawk, it demonstrated both the desperation and the courage of his band as they attempted to defend their families and homelands with limited resources against a numerically superior enemy. The Battle of Wisconsin Heights, that we are going to then see up here in the state of Wisconsin, about 2 months later, was a defensive action during the retreat northward into present-day Wisconsin. Blackhawk's rear guard, composing mostly of Sauk and Fox warriors, engaged pursuing U.S. forces in a deliberate effort to delay them and allow all non-combatants, such as women, children, elders, to escape. The native fighters inflicted significant casualties on the Illinois militia, highlighting their tactical skill and their commitment to facing overwhelming odds. The battle underscored Blackhawk's continued commitment to protecting his people and the continued resistance of Great Lakes tribes against removal and disposition. The final and most devastating confrontation happened at the Battle of Bad Axe, right here, just a short week and a half later, in which Blackhawk's band attempted to cross back over the Mississippi River into Minnesota for safety. U.S. Army forces, as well as both Wisconsin and Illinois state militias, attacked indiscriminately, killing hundreds of women, children, men along the banks of the Mississippi River. The massacre effectively ended the Blackhawk War and marked the collapse of organized military resistance east of the Mississippi River. For Blackhawk and his allies, the battle was both a tragic defeat and a symbol of the harsh realities of U.S. expansionist policy, illustrating the extreme consequences of resisting removal from ancestral lands. The Blackhawk War, though short, had lasting significance. For the United States, it reinforced federal and state authority in the old Northwest Territory and accelerated the removal of all native tribes from Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, I'm sorry. For Blackhawk and his allies, the war represented their final attempt to assert sovereignty, defend ancestral homes, and resist loss of their cultural and political autonomy. Despite defeat, the courage, strategic skill, and moral conviction of Blackhawk and his followers became the enduring symbols of Indigenous resistance and resilience in the face of overwhelming American power. Remember, I always said I was going to talk about regional aftermath. So all these green lines are spots from where Indigenous tribes were and where they were then relocated to. So as you can kind of see, I know it's a little, it's a lot all at once, but we're talking about some of these small little spots right in here is where we're going to see lots of the tribes that I've been talking about today. You see that tiny little spot here is where the Sauk and Fox were, primarily because after the Blackhawk War, lots of the tribe was gone at this point. So after the Blackhawk War, many Great Lakes tribes faced continued pressures to cede lands and relocate west of the Mississippi. The Sauk and Fox were forced entirely out of Illinois and eventually most of Iowa, resettling and was what now is Kansas and later Oklahoma. The Potawatomi experienced a series of treaties throughout the 1830s, including the 1833 Treaty of Chicago, which ceded all of their lands in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, leading to forced marches west in the harsh winter known as the Potawatomi Trail of Death. The Ho-Chunk, also known as the Winnebago, were gradually removed from southern Wisconsin, though some bands resisted or returned, facing repeated treaty pressures and relocations. The Ojibwe, also known as Chippewa, and the Odawa in Michigan and Wisconsin also ceded substantial tracts throughout treaties in the 1830s and 40s. losing most of the control over key resources and enduring confinement to smaller and smaller reservation lands. For these tribes, the decades after 1832 were defined by a pattern of displacement and adaptation. While some communities managed to maintain a presence in parts of their ancestral territories, the loss of fertile farmland, their hunting grounds, and cultural sites disrupted traditional ways of life. Federally imposed boundaries and reservations combined with settler encroachment ensured that indigenous nations of the Great Lakes region had to navigate a new reality of restricted sovereignty, economic dependence, and cultural survival, a continuation of the challenges foreshadowed by the defeat of Blackhawk's band and the military assertion of control in the early 1830s. So I've talked a lot about some of these things, and I want to make sure I have some room for questions and stuff too. But a couple of key things that I'd like for you all to think about as takeaways is that there was resilience and agency. Native nations in the Great Lakes demonstrated remarkable resilience and agency, forming alliances and resisting U.S. expansion throughout both diplomacy and warfare. Their leadership and unity shaped the course of history in profound and significant ways. This was a transformative era. The period from 1803 to 1832 was marked by a significant series of treaties, wars, and forced removals that dramatically reshaped the lives and homelands of indigenous people here in the Midwest. Resistance and consequences. Even events like the War of 1812 and the Blackhawk War highlight both the strength of Native resistance and the devastating consequences of U.S. expansionist policies. And finally, the ongoing impact. Understanding this history is essential for recognizing the ongoing impact of past injustices and importance of honoring indigenous perspectives in the conversation today. Any questions? I'm sure there's lots. If you want to go ahead, wait for Barb to get us the mic here quick.
Be sure and hold this up to your mouth. If you could back up 2 slides. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you look at the little peak that goes up there.
Yes.
Right there.
Mm-hmm.
If you go directly east from there. If you go directly east,
Yeah.
You're on Cedar Grove, Wisconsin.
Yes.
Where many, many people connected to Holland, Michigan have family that came from that area because that was only 12 years later. I mean, there's only 12 years between this 1833 and the arrival of Van Raalte.
Yep.
Now, when Raalte started out from the Netherlands, he was planning to go to Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they'd written home about. That's what they'd heard the most about. And of course, the term Wisconsin probably referred to a big area. It didn't necessarily mean if you say, we're going to Wisconsin.
Yeah.
But their little march on the boat was on Wisconsin, and we're going to Wisconsin and like that. And their mind was changed when they met Judge Kellogg from Kalamazoo, who with a number of other people were pitching Michigan to them and persuaded them that Michigan would be better. I'm sure you know.
I do. Yeah.
But was it in fact, now go to the map that shows something of Holland there, this one. It looks like Holland, Michigan is right between a little green and a tan right there.
Yeah.
In there.
So it's right in here is actually where we're
So
talking about.
was it in fact a more, quote, safe and peaceable area in Michigan, or was that really not true? I mean, I think the settlers were getting the message in the letters and everything. Don't worry, the U.S. Army has things under control and we've made treaties and blah, blah, blah. You won't have to worry about
by that time, primarily lots of the tribes in the area, like I said, with the Potawatomi Trail of Death, like essentially marching with U.S. troops, marching every tribal individual, man, woman, child, elder, out of that space. At that point, there was not a significant indigenous threat. It was more that probably that other settlers got there first, and less about that. And it's also something that if we're looking at this particular map, and we're talking about where I've got that red dot now, aka where we're at here, versus getting across the other lake. At that point, you're talking about I've crossed the Atlantic. I've now crossed roughly 800 to 1,000 miles in the United States, whether that's partly by lake, partly by river, partly by land, whatever it is. Not saying that this is the case. I'm not a native Hollander, so I don't know the full depth of all the decisions that were made to settle here. But I would assume that at least part of it was just like, yeah, this is good.
Okay.
Like, you know what? We're along the lake, which is what we were expecting to be anyway. Yeah, this is good. Versus
that-
going like, oh my gosh, one more lake, or oh my gosh, one more river.
Well, many of his people were wintering in Detroit.
Mhm.
And then Venalti takes this difficult path across to be persuaded. But they knew he was going to buy about 70,000 acres. Venalti bought 70,000 acres. So, and that was all the money that the whole group had.
Mhm.
So he was putting all his marbles in one basket.
In one basket, yep.
So Kellogg had something at stake to persuade these highly eligible, farmers and people who
Yeah.
would be, quote, good settlers because they knew how to work together and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So they're trying to persuade them to come to Ottawa County. But Venalti, as you probably know, did pay $26 to the Indians for the area around Collin Park.
Mhm.
Over there to be able to, the story was, use their summer lands further north, and that it was a peaceful agreement. So it appears that Venalti at least tried to
Yes.
deal with the situation, is his situation, and treat the Indians.
Yeah, and that's where, like, I mean, we're talking about thousands of Indian agents, thousands of treaties that have been signed. Unfortunately, for the most part, lots of them were done nefariously or broken. But for the most part, from what I've seen about the Van Raalte one, at least good intention was the plan. But it's
On
still
Van
one of those
Raalte's
things.
part.
Yes,
But not every one of his settlers was under control. There
Agreed.
still could be
yes,
fence disputes and pig thefts and all kinds
And
of
everything.
terrible things that all the settlers were running.
yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
During the period of time you've covered historically.
Yes.
How big an impact was difference in languages among the tribes an impediment to their ability to cooperate?
It's a great question, actually. So primarily, the major tribes that I've talked about today, obviously the tribes with sacred fire, Potawatomi, Odawa, Ojibwe, as well as the Sauk and the Fox, all had a base language of Algonquin. So it's not that everybody spoke the same language. It's similar in, I try to compare it in similarity to when we kind of package all the Romance languages together. So that base knowledge of Latin, that base knowledge of Latin is the comparison of Algonquin. So the idea that the base knowledge or the base language is an Algonquin base, Algonquin dialect, and then you have some variations, just like you have between French and Italian, or French and Romanian. You have enough that's probably passable, and it gets to a spot because you continually trade with these individuals on a regular basis. I mean, you're talking about Blackhawk going from Western Illinois, almost Iowa, all the way over to Detroit, and still feeling comfortable enough between translators and stuff like that. And we're talking about native translators. So let's say a member of Tecumseh's Confederacy is then translating to Blackhawk's Confederacy and vice versa. We're not talking about a white translator between the two of them. But we're talking about more often than not, it was passable enough that we could communicate without having to have a translator. Whereas like potentially significant regional differences might have changed the language slightly. So each tribe had slight variations, just like we all kind of talk slightly different. I don't talk like a Southerner or a Californian or whatever, but we can all more often than not passively understand each other. except my roommate from Kentucky. I can't understand him at all. Former roommate from Kentucky. But essentially it's that kind of base language is Algonquin. When you get farther west, and into like the Lakota and stuff like that, or whatever, that's a drastically different language change. So we're talking about like Romance languages to German. So we're talking about a very significant difference. And so that's when we start talking about Lakota, Dakota, and I'm going to use it because it's a language term, not because of it's a cultural term, but like a Siouan language base is similar to an Algonquin language base. So the Siouan for Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and lots of those that are in that kind of mountain region, as well as the Dakotas area, speak a drastically different language, but most of us here in the Midwest spoke a base language of Algonquin. Yes.
I see your map up there, this regional map, and it seems like there's a defined line for where the Indians went. Now, we always hear about the Trail of Tears going to Oklahoma, but there seems to be a significant line that the Indians were kicked out of Iowa and Missouri and so on very quickly.
Yes.
And sent west. So what is the line that the US government said,
Right
we
here.
want all these people on the other side of this river or line?
It's the Missouri River, actually. So up here in the northern portion is actually the Missouri River, and essentially they just drew a straight line down after that because then the Missouri River kind of floats into this. But essentially what they used along the Iowa border is the Missouri River as a defining line of like, all right, cool, they're on the other side of a river. This is all US now. That's Indian territory.
Okay, we think of the Mississippi River and west. But
Yeah.
actually, as far as the Indians were concerned, they were shifted.
After this period, in 1832, all of this land is now I don't know if anybody's been to Iowa, spent any time in Iowa. I spent a lot of time in Iowa, obviously. Is that it's very fertile land here on the continent. And obviously settlers wanted it, the US wanted it for exports, as well as feeding American citizens. So very quickly they went, all right, cool, let's push them farther and farther. And at that point, because due to the lack of full population in for the Americans at this point, the Missouri River was far enough, because then you had Iowa and everything else to be able to use. Eventually, farther into the 1800s, you see more and more of that land kind of shrink, and more of it be used for further and further farmland, like beginning into Nebraska, the Dakotas, and stuff like that as well. Answer your question? Okay.
Getting back to languages.
Mhm.
Isn't there s-
Mhm.
Isn't there some binding of communities, as Indians were more alike to Indians
Mhm.
than they were to the guys coming in,
Yeah.
so that there's some sense of a language could pass that way to
Yes.
experience.
Yes, absolutely. And like I said, we're talking about individuals that had been in this region for several hundred years at this point. So while we talk about, I mean, obviously people didn't live to a super ripe old age at this point either, but we're talking about generations and generations of individuals that grew up on these lands, but also interacted and butted up against several of these lands all the time too. And sometimes it meant trade, sometimes it meant war, sometimes it meant just alliances. Yeah, I think at that point there was already kind of this like base understanding of like we all kind of understand each other. But I believe desperation in this time frame, as well as a unified enemy and that unifier of an enemy, pushing them all to want to make things work even better. I'm sure that there was lots of shorthand, probably even, I mean, when you go from different regions, or if we have allies overseas and we're interacting with people, maybe we don't understand their full language, shorthand was a big thing too. So that way that we can make sure that we understood what we were doing, and that I've got my job and role in this particular battle or this particular scouting mission or something like that. So that way everybody understood their assignments. I'm sure that a lot of that happened too. But also, I think part of it is because there was so much interaction between tribes and between alliances and stuff like that too. Like it was just, people grew up to be translators between tribes. It wasn't necessarily, I feel like it was rapidly increased in this period of time, that kind of like late 1700s, early 1800s. But I think that there was already this base translator for tribes between other tribes as a way of communicating, so that this happened much faster and very rapidly, and was a lot smoother, primarily because of the base language, but also because of the traditional ties that they already have too. Yes.
I hesitate to bring this up, but because Linda talked about a migration story of the opportunism of the emptying of this land and
Yeah.
the people who's flooded in immediately after. My family is one of them also. And I know you went to a college in Bourbonnais.
Yes, I did.
And we're French Canadian, and
Yeah.
our family grew up in that whole Kankakee River Basin,
Mhm.
St. Anne, Kankakee, Bourbonnais in
Yeah.
there. And that was another one of those stories. The Potawatomi were vacated.
Yeah.
And these people had stories too. That's the saddest part about
Yeah.
migration stories. Everybody had a sad story. They didn't come because they wanted to hurt somebody else.
Exactly.
They were fleeing, and the people in French Canada had pretty sad stories of their own after
Yep.
the British took over. And the church wasn't too great to them either. And they all had 13 children, and
Yep.
they didn't know what to do with all these children. They really had so many children, they didn't know what to do.
Yep.
And so they followed the water.
I have one and I already don't know what I'm doing. So I get that.
So they followed the water. And when they hear that there's this beautiful fertile land in
Mhm.
Illinois, they flooded in, and my grandparents grew up not speaking English. They they went to school speaking French, and they learned their English when they got to school.
Yeah.
And so these are all stories, and we all relate to them and we resonate to them, while we still resonate
Mhm.
to the pain of the people who got moved off.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is when I talk about these things, I hope that my conversation I'm bringing this about is, I'm not saying we all as Americans are the worst thing that have ever happened to the state of the world ever. Definitely not my intention. My intention is only to speak about the agency of primarily state and federal governments at the time, or territorial governments at the time, using this as an opportunity to then create more opportunities for folks that were in a dire strait in situations. So in this time period, I would just say that none of it's good. People have bad stories across the board, and this is not ever meant to hopefully ever make anyone feel bad about themselves or about their family story or anything else. This is primarily just meant to bring about another layer of understanding on the land that we currently occupy, and the history of this land is both rich and valuable, and goes beyond just the Dutch heritage of this region or the French Canadian heritage of Kankakee Bourbonnais. But at the same time, it's very important to remember that this wasn't just vacant land, and that there was a history before us as well, and that we are just adding our story alongside. I think is a really important part of that as well.
I have a question from
Yeah.
online. You had mentioned your paper, or
Yes.
your report. Where can that be found?
On my flash drive. I don't.
Oh, okay, okay.
I normally don't like to be able to tote those things just because it's not a certified paper. It was a graduation paper that I needed to finish. So it's not a like published paper. But if you are looking for further information on Chief Blackhawk, I highly recommend the Blackhawk Museum in Rock Island, Illinois. It's right along the Mississippi River. And if you go there during the spring or the summer, it's actually really lovely because you're able to be right there in the state park as well. And you can enjoy the area a little bit too and learn quite a bit more about him as well. So yeah, Rock Island, Illinois, it's right off Interstate 80. If you get to the largest truck stop in the United States, you've gone too far. Go back about 20 miles and enjoy something that I think is much more enjoyable by enjoying the nature of that as well as the history of Blackhawk and the region itself.
I have a basic question.
Absolutely.
I was raised in the Delaware and South Jersey, and we used to walk down to a Quaker graveyard, and we used to always told about John Filmick signing a treaty with the Lenipes
Mhm.
and how friendly they were and how they got took because I guess they just gave them jewelry or something.
Yeah.
But I never knew what happened to them. I
Mhm.
mean, there were supposed to be a lot of like Delaware Indians. Did they
Yeah.
just all get gently pushed out without war?
Yeah. So primarily, like I've talked about in previous classes, and I mean, if you want more information, I can push you in the right direction for lots of things. That's my subtle pinch to, hey, make sure you have a library card as the librarian here in the room. But in this time period, we're talking about the United States is already very well established, but previous time period before we consider ourselves the United States and we're just considered British colonies, you still already had individuals, indigenous individuals that originally were based along the East Coast had already been pushed farther inward. Yeah, and it's that constant ebb and flow of pushed farther by American settlers, conflict rise up between indigenous people that had been there, had been in the land that they were pushed to already, and then concessions, unification with indigenous tribes, because again, we are more alike than we are with the Americans. So it's this constant like back and forth of constantly being pushed farther and farther west, and conflict between native tribes because you're coming onto our land, but we're fleeing American encroachment. So it's a constant ebb and flow of this or whatever. But yeah, by this period in time or whatever, the individuals that had lived in Delaware were residing in the Mississippi River Valley, and along like the Rock River Valley and stuff like that too, and constantly getting pushed farther in. So Indiana, Michigan, some of Illinois, at this point already too. Yeah.
Just a quick question of protocol.
Yeah.
Odawa.
Yes.
Ottawa, that's previously we pronounced, is Ottawa, is
Yes.
that no longer properly used?
So
Ottawa?
either one is fine.
Are they still interchangeable?
They're still relatively interchangeable. When you're interacting with an indigenous person in present day, they prefer Odawa, with a D sounding versus a T. The T is the double T actually probably comes from the French fur traders when they were interacting with them, and not pronouncing that harder D kind of sound. Again, Algonquin was not a written language at this point or whatever too. So anytime that French fur traders were interacting and actually wrote notes or diary journals or something like that or whatever, it kind of floated back and forth, just kind of depending on who heard it and how they wanted to write it down. Because again, the Algonquin didn't have a written language at the time. It was only a verbal language at the time.
Yeah, I have a question here. Well, maybe it's more comments.
Yeah.
And I myself prefer to use Ottawa because we are in Ottawa County, and
Yeah.
it helps us to remember that there is this connection with the native
Definitely.
people
Yeah.
who lived here. They actually were enemies of the Sauk and the Fox.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Sauk and the Fox used to live in Michigan.
Mhm.
They up around Saginaw. That's where the word Saginaw came from. It's a corruption of the word for Sauk. And in 1642, there was a big war
Mhm.
between the Ottawa and their allies, the Potawatomi and the Ojibwe. And they drove out the Sauk and the Fox,
Yep.
and they ended up in Wisconsin, fleeing the battle,
Yep.
and they never came back
Nope.
to Michigan. It's remarkable that Tecumseh was able to gather these enemies together
Ancient enemies, yes.
to fight together.
Mhm.
You know, and he must have been a superb diplomat and managed to pull that off. So I just find that one of the amazing facts surrounding the War of 1812. The other thing I wanted to comment on, the Treaty of Chicago, 1821, ceded the lands in Michigan south of the Grand River.
Yes.
Yeah, and that included Potawatomi territory
Yeah.
at the time. And so the Potawatomi actually got driven out to some degree. Although I have to say one of my better friends is a Potawatomi. And then it wasn't until the Treaty of I believe it's Washington D.C. in 1836 that the lands north of the Grand River were ceded.
Mhm.
The pressures from the settlers were not that great for the northern Michigan areas. And so the government wasn't really pushing it at that point. And they were getting a lot of pushback from Americans, American settlers, saying, "Hey, you know, there's driving all these people off their lands isn't necessarily right."
Yeah, and that's where like part of the at the time we're talking about like mineral rights and stuff like that was more important to them versus the idea of actual seceding of the land like along Superior and even in northern Michigan. They were more interested in the export and the use of copper than they were necessarily for the land in northern Michigan and the UP at that point. Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions, thoughts? Got time for probably like one, maybe two, depending on length.
I've read a fair amount about how European diseases impacted the
Yep.
in European invasion of Central America, for example.
Yes.
What kind of impact did European diseases have on this period of history that you're speaking of?
At this point of history, lots of that disease didn't have necessarily as much of a major impact. We're talking about that first encounter kind of time period or whatever, early 1700s is when that major impact happened of European diseases. And then you'll see later on into the 1800s, as we move farther and farther west, there are outbreaks of things like smallpox and stuff like that that dramatically affect like the Nez Perce and different tribal cultures in the Southwest region primarily. But lots of those European diseases have already swept through and made their dramatic impact already. Mostly because by this period of time, most tribes are already either in trade negotiations. Before it was the French, but now they're in trade negotiations, obviously either with the British or with Americans at this point. So most of that level of disease has already cut through and made its impact on the various tribes in the region too. So I will say, I'm going to real quick say one more thing. If you do want to learn more about any of these groups, I highly recommend checking out some of the local powwows. You're totally allowed to go and just be absorbed in a powwow and being able to watch the dancing and hear the music and listen to the drums of the different tribes here in the area. I had the privilege 2 weeks ago to go to the Gun Lake kids camp called GJAC and got to be able to hear a drum circle for a brief period of time. But there are powwows here in the area that I highly recommend going to because while I have talked about this as a historical point, again, as Barb mentioned, I'm not Indigenous, but I highly recommend making sure that when we talk about this particular information, we are talking about the past, but these people are still here. And it's not something to think about was all the time. I highly recommend thinking about present as well. So this is my push to make sure that you try to interact with our local tribes as well as making sure you read Indigenous fiction. Indigenous authors have a great perspective and a different and unique take on fiction that I highly recommend as well. You can look them up online. So Grand Valley University does one once a year, and then some of the local tribes on their websites will post when they're going to be available and which ones are public and which ones are private. But highly recommend. They're very wonderful, very immersive, and definitely helps change the perspective of just was history past and present is and the agency that these tribes still have both on their own futures and the futures of their kids.
I'm afraid it's 11 o'clock. And we need to thank Jake for being here this morning.
Thank you.
And for those of you who might want to go over this again, as you know, at the end of the year, the videos will be available.